At any rate, we did get CM Punk and Seth Rollins in a cage match. So naturally, people are going to compare the two cage matches that happened in the two biggest promotions in the world. One on a major pay-per-view, one in Madison Square Garden, one of the hallowed halls of pro wrestling historically. On what many would argue is the flagship show of pro wrestling, Monday Night Raw. So naturally, people are going to compare those two matches. And, unlike that feckless coward, Bully Ray, who, was too scared to compare the two matches, despite putting out a very loaded bait tweet. I'll read you the tweet. I think most of you are probably familiar with it now. But at the conclusion of the Raw cage match, here's what Bully Ray had to say, and I quote, "All capital letters, that was awesome. That period was period awesome! Exclamation point, exclamation point. All caps," and this is important, "that's," cap locks turned off, "what a steel cage match is supposed to be. Two men fighting, ... in a cage. Two men having a wrestling match in a cage. Loved the finish. Loved the aftermath. Bravo, gents. Flexing bicep emoji. Talk tomorrow at Busted Open. Hashtag WWE Raw. Hashtag Raw on Netflix." Do those two things really need two different hashtags? Because they're the kind of hashtags that bring up like a little symbol afterwards, like a little emoji gimmick. So they're like official hashtags. Do we need both hashtag WWE Raw and hashtag Raw on Netflix? What, doesn't one suffice? But anyway, clearly you could see what Bully was doing there. Okay, by capitalizing the word "that's" in the sentence, "that's what a steel cage match is supposed to be," it is very obvious that, he was baiting people based on the fact that there was a cage match, a controversial cage match, the day before on the AEW pay-per-view. Now, of course, Bully Ray, he's pulling this whole "who, me?" routine. Because, of course, when people make that very obvious connection into what he's doing, he denies it. For the first person in the replies, "Do you have to denigrate one match in your attempt to compliment another?" And Bully Ray replies, "Which match did I denigrate? All I did was praise this match." Okay, buddy. Like, you don't know exactly what you were doing. And he does know exactly what he's doing, and we all know what he's doing. And of course, he turned this into a controversy that he knew exactly that he was stirring up, and he directed everybody to his little Busted Open show the next day. And that's the whole point. On top of the fact that, this guy, the mask is completely off. He's not just part of the well-oiled, well-coordinated WWE media PR, operative that we know exists. He's literally an employee of WWE. He conducts his Busted Open After Dark show from NXT, on Tuesdays after NXT events from the venues. He was in a segment at Roadblock Not End of the Line tonight with Fraxium. He filmed a segment on the show with those guys. He frequently does WWE pre-shows, both through the main roster and NXT pay-per-views. He works for the company. He takes money from the company. He's an employee. So, of course, his views are slanted. Of course, we all know what he's doing. So, look, at this point, because he's a paid employee of WWE, his show is really not all that much different than the AEW podcast hosted by a girl ref. And does Will Washington still do it? I don't even know. I haven't listened to that podcast, in all honesty, since the pandemic. And I mean heart of the pandemic, when we were getting, no fan shows and there was just nothing to do. And I would listen to the AEW podcast. They'd have Taz and Jim Ross from their homes. And it's the last time that's 5 years ago. But I think it still exists. And obviously it's an AEW, but you're not going there to hear hard-hitting AEW critique. There's not much difference between what they're doing, though, and what Bully Ray is doing on Busto, because he works for the company. There's an obvious conflict of interest. So, but no, I don't think Bully Ray's a coward. I don't think he's a feckless coward. I said that in jest at the top by very clearly burying the cage match on Sunday by putting over the cage match on Monday as strong as he did in that tweet. And of course, he goes on his show and he does basically, do you guys know that tweet? Oh, I'm just a little guy. Don't hit me. I'm a little guy. I'm the little birthday boy. That's basically Bully Ray in real life, what he's doing here. What do you mean? I didn't say AEW. I didn't bring up the other cage match. Oh, I'm not doing the tribalism. Of course he is. And he wants you to listen to his show. And then he goes on his show and says, I never brought up the one match, but these fans from this company, they can't help themselves. When he clearly was baiting people. And he knows they're going to take the bait. I'm taking it right now. Of course people are going to take the bait. I'm taking the bait right now, and I'm embarrassed for myself. But he knows what he was doing. So anyway, I'm just using this as a launch point, because unlike Bully Ray, who's going to throw his hands up after being the worker that he is, because that's all he is, he's a worker, and getting everybody all worked into, he's sitting home right now, pointing at his temple, saying, I worked all the marks. They all listened to Busted Open the next day, because I baited them, because I'm Bully Ray, I'm a great... That's what he's doing. But unlike Bully Ray, who threw his hands up, and, put up this awful ruse and pretended that he wasn't comparing the matches, because, far be it from... He's the birthday, I'm a little birthday boy. Don't hit me. I am going to directly compare the matches. I'm going to show some guts. And I'm going to come on here today and I'm going to directly compare CM Punk versus Seth Rollins and Will Ospreay versus Kyle Fletcher. And I'm going to put it right in the title of this show. Will Ospreay versus Kyle Fletcher versus CM Punk and Seth Rollins. And I'm going to make sure it's not as awkwardly phrased as I just did here. And yeah, I'm going to try to sell some subs. But you know what? I'm going to be honest about it, unlike Bully Ray, who thinks he's fooling everybody with the little routine that he has going on. And it's so funny because everybody sees through this guy now. But I'll show some guts. I'll directly compare the matches. Fair and down the middle like I always am. Look, I thought these were both very flawed cage matches. We talked in depth on the IRL when it comes to Ospreay Fletcher, so I won't go as in depth on that match since I just did it 24 hours ago. But I think really what it comes down to is the basic difference between these two matches is I thought Will Ospreay, Kyle Fletcher was a great match that had flaws. And CM Punk, Seth Rollins was a good match that had flaws. And oddly enough, I think they had very similar flaws. I guess not oddly enough, ironically enough, they had very similar flaws. I just think that one match was a great match and one match was a pretty good match. The most obvious flaw that both matches had was that, and this is a complaint that I've had, a complaint that Rich Craich has had, a complaint that we've had together when we do audio, is we continue to subvert what a cage match is supposed to be. It doesn't matter what company it is, it doesn't matter what promotion it is. And it drives me nuts. We've lost what the point of a cage match is supposed to be. And ironically enough, Bully Ray says that's what a steel cage match is supposed to be. No, it isn't. Two men fighting in a cage, two men having a wrestling match in the cage. And then he says, love the finish. I mean, I don't know. Bully Ray is in his early 50s. He grew up in the same part of the country I did. He's older than me. He's got a few years on me, but we grew up basically on the same wrestling. And, unless he was getting alternate feeds of these things, that's never what a cage match was and isn't what a cage match is supposed to be. The problem is all of these promotions, you stop having these cage matches if you want other people running in on the match. The cage match is supposed to prevent that. The point of a cage match, historically, was it's a big blow-off match, and it served one of two purposes, right? Purpose number one, and this was really in the territory days, you'd often see this, it was, all right, we've been feuding for a long time. I hate your guts, you hate mine. Let's do this inside of a cage. What that'll do is it's going to keep your boys out of this thing. It's going to keep my boys out of this thing, and it's mano a mano. It's me and you. And one of us is going to walk out of this thing, and the other is going to be crippled. And we're going to put an end to this dispute. No one else is going to be involved. It's just me and you, buddy. The point of the cage was to keep everybody else out of the match. And in the territory days, you'd often see that they'd often do the spot where at some point in the match, at the pinnacle, of the match, a bunch of heels would run down. They would try to climb up the side of the cage, and the women would be squealing, and the men would be screaming, and the fans would be going nuts. And then an army of baby faces would come out from the back and pull the heels down off of the cage, and the whole place would pop. And it's like, because to hammer home the idea of this is one-on-one. Your friends can't help you now. You're on your own, dastardly heel. And that was the point of that spot. That would be the point of that spot when they would do that, when the heels would try to climb the cage and the baby faces would stop them. And then there's the other reason to do a cage match, and old school WWF, Bruno Sammartino, who made the cage matches famous in that company. It would be, all right, you fucker. You beat up my buddies. Whether it was Chief Jay Strongbow or Dominic DeNucci or whoever the fuck. You showed up here in New York. You beat up my buddies. You beat me up. We've had matches before. And you've bloodied me. You've beaten me. I've gotten disqualified, beaten you back. We got to put an end to this. And what Bruno would do is he'd have cage matches with these heels as the big blow-offs. And it wasn't to keep people out. Like in my other example. It would be to keep the guy in. So Bruno could beat him to a bloody pulp. Once and for all. And in that territory, the rules were you could simply walk out of the cage. It's twofold. And I think a lot of you listening, my listeners are probably aware of this, but maybe if this clip ends up on YouTube, it'll teach some people some things. Number one, there was no climbing over the cage in those days. And number two, they added the finish where by leaving the cage you can win, because it made Bruno look like the ultimate tough guy, because he would beat his opponent so badly that he would just power walk his way and strut out of that cage to show his superior alpha superiority. That's where that came from. That was the psychology behind that, and why the cage matches in the WWF were different than the cage matches in some other places. Later on, climbing the cage became a thing because WWF had those unique rules where escaping the cage could lead to a victory. I think escaping the cage should no longer be a thing because post Bruno, it became a booking crutch. And really, logically, it doesn't make sense. I mean, the idea escape the cage, that runs counter to the psychology of a cage match. The psychology of a cage match, as I said, is to intentionally lock each other in there with one another because you want to kill the other guy. Escaping to win sounds a little cowardly, especially when you're climbing over the top. I think over time that should have went away. The psychology of marching out the cage door worked for Bruno in that time and place. It made him look like the ultimate alpha male when he finally put a stop to George Steele or whoever the fuck. So, what I'm getting at here is we constantly now have lost the plot and missed the point of what a cage match is supposed to be. It's supposed to keep people out. It's supposed to keep you in. And what happens nearly every single time in these cage matches, somebody gets in there anyway. And that was a massive flaw in both of these cage matches that we've seen over the last couple of days. Talked about it on the IRL, the Mark Davis spot. Completely killed the momentum of the Ospreay Fletcher cage match. And also hurt the rest of the match, even though Ospreay disposed of him rather easily. With Davis bringing in a bag full of weapons, it totally took away from what I thought would have been the key spot of the entire match, Fletcher finding the hidden screwdriver at the top of the cage. That spot would have had way more impact had they not already bludgeoned each other with chairs and barbed wire bats and chainsaws and shotguns and everything else. It would have been far more impactful for Fletcher to find the screwdriver that Callis hid at the top of the cage. And then it'd be like, whoa, he's got this massive edge now because he snuck a weapon in there, that motherfucker. But we ruined that by sending Mark Davis out there with a bag full of weapons. Then we had community theater time at the end of the match where Kyle Fletcher is screaming, I hate you! I hate you! Trikey! Before Ospreay put him away. And again, oddly enough, I have the same complaints about the Raw match. The finish was utterly preposterous. Utterly preposterous. With the door cage open. And give Punk and Rollins credit. Very early in the match, they both swung open that door and offered the other guy a chance to walk out and win. Go ahead and walk out. You can win I'll let you win this match, but you're going to show how much of a fucking coward you are. So go ahead, pal. And of course, neither one of them took the opportunity. It's a long-standing rivalry, same as Ospreay Fletcher. You know, there are a lot of similarities between these two matches. I thought both feuds and both rivalries, necessitated the cage match here. The cage match was a logical next step in both of these feuds. But they can never resist the temptation of getting someone else involved in a cage match, which subverts the whole point of the cage match to begin with. And I hate it. And both of these matches did it. And I thought both examples were pretty egregious. The Raw cage match probably worse because it was the direct finish. For those who didn't see it, after these two guys had they had their match, the door is open. Seth is leaning against the ropes, sitting down in the corner against the ropes by the open door. Crowd starts going apeshit, tight camera angle. Roman comes down, pulls Seth out of the ring through the door. So Seth, quote unquote, wins. And then Roman proceeds to beat the shit out of both guys, obviously building the three-way that they're going to have at WrestleMania. A ridiculous finish. A preposterous, ridiculous, stupid finish. At that point, why even have the cage match? And this is why this is a massively flawed match. They could have just had a match and had Roman come down and beat both guys up, instead of bastardizing the cage stipulation again, like we always do, by Roman pulling him out and Seth, quote unquote, winning because he went through the door and touched the floor. Well, the reason they did a cage match is because they want to pop a number. I understand that. But the rub there is you continue to teach your audience that a cage match doesn't really keep other people out of the mix and not involved. It never does. It's more of a surprise when there isn't a run-in on a cage match than when there is. And that's a big problem. Because if you went a few years without doing that in a cage match, when you do a finish like this, or when you do a run-in, or when someone manages to get into the cage in a sleazy way, it has that much more impact. So no, bully, that's not what a steel cage is supposed to be. Bruno never had his opponent pulled through. Well, Bruno never had someone pull him through the door and have him win in a cheap, derivative way. It was not two men fighting in a cage. A third man got involved. Now, the Ospreay Fletcher match not only was a much more dynamic match, I thought they made use of the cage itself much better than Punk and Roman did. Punk and Roman didn't really make use of the cage. They had a wrestling match inside of a cage. Bully was right about that. Two men having a wrestling match in a cage. That's exactly what it was. They barely incorporated the cage. They did the one superplex spot where Punk climbed up to the top, teased that he was going to jump off the top of the cage. He didn't. Seth went up there and grabbed him. They did a superplex. Outside of that spot, this, you could, if you take away the cage, nothing changes. They barely use the cage. Ospreay and Fletcher used the cage. I mean, Ospreay and Fletcher bled all over the place. Now look, Punk and Rollins couldn't bleed. New York State Athletic Commission, I get that. But there's a way to do violence and get the hatred across without bleeding. So yeah, they were handicapped in that way, but they didn't do anything in this match that would have led to blood had it taken place in a state that did allow blood. They didn't get across any kind of extra sense of violence or hatred in this match. They basically had the same match they had in January without the cage on Raw. Which was, again, just a good little match, which is what this was. This was a good little match with a horrendous finish. That's what this was. Fletcher and Ospreay was a nasty, violent spectacle of a cage match with palpable hatred and violence, enhanced with the blood, with a terrible run-in by Mark Davis, and that probably missed the peak by about 5 minutes, and then had the community theater stuff at the finish. Again, it was a great match with some obvious flaws. Punk and Rollins was a pretty good match with some obvious flaws. And that's the difference between the two. I mean, if you want a stronger opinion, I think anyone that thinks Punk and Rollins was the better match needs their fucking head examined. You can't possibly come to that conclusion if you're being fair. Didn't have the violence, didn't have the hatred, didn't have the blood, whether they were handicapped and couldn't do it or not. Allegedly, Punk wanted to bleed. He was told he couldn't. And both had very similar flaws. And one had a finish that was way worse than the other. And that was the Raw match. And by the way, the Raw match did the community theater nonsense too when we zoomed in on Seth Rollins and he cut in a mid-match promo on Punk. I hate you. You're such an asshole with his little puppet voice. So they both had the community theater nonsense. They both had a run-in, which subverts the whole point of a cage match. It's just one match was a great match with those flaws. The other match was a pretty good match with those flaws. And the escape the cage stuff, I mean, it's got to go away. I mean, now what they do is they have the escape the cage and pinfalls and submissions. I mean, let's just go all the way and get rid of the escape the cage, but they won't because it's an easy booking crutch and you saw it play out. You saw it play out with this finish with Roman. We had the totally unearned "This is awesome" chant during this match. It wasn't. There's nothing awesome about the match. And this was even before the closing stretch, which featured nothing but finisher kickouts and them stealing each other's finishers and kicking out and all of that. Again, it was very much like the January match. And it was very much like the WWE house style match with all the finisher kickouts. It just happened to have a fence around all four sides of the ring, which they really didn't utilize at all. Then we had Paul Heyman come down, and he's in there consoling Punk. Jowls bouncing around like a pog, taking back shots. Roman gets all insulted. So, as per the usual with WWE, the match mattered less than the story. Some people like that. I think you could tell your stories in the ring. You could tell your stories with finishes, but this is a company that's been telling us for how many years now that finishes don't matter. They've taught their audience that, and they've been successful teaching their audience that because their audience parrots that now. Brian James used to go on Twitter all the time about a decade ago, constantly professing that the finishes do not matter. The winners and the losers do not matter. That's not the kind of pro wrestling I enjoy. I enjoy pro wrestling where the wins and losses matter a lot, where it's the most important thing, and you tell your stories in the ring as much as you tell them outside the ring, and you tell your stories with the results as much as you do outside the ring. That's not how WWE works, and they've taught their fan base that, and their fan base accepts it. It literally does not matter that Seth Rollins won, quote unquote, won this cage match with the silly finish. All that matters is the setup with where do Paul Heyman's allegiances lie, with CM Punk or with Roman Reigns. If that's what you like in your pro wrestling, then yeah, you probably like the match and all of the post-match stuff more than I did. See, in my view, you can do all these stories outside the ring to set up the stories you're telling in the ring without making the finishes and the wins and losses not matter. That should always be what matters the most. That's where the best and most effective drama in pro wrestling comes from. A well-built match and you don't know who the fuck is going to win. Didn't matter who won this match. Did not matter. And that's another edge for the cage match we saw on Sunday. Setting Kyle Fletcher's promo, mid-match promo aside, which is something, again, that's very overdone in pro wrestling today. Will Ospreay covered in blood. And Kyle Fletcher covered in blood. He's had this war. And Will knocks him out with that hidden blade. One of the nastiest, the best finisher in wrestling, by the way. To me, by a comfortable margin. And one of the best looking hidden blades we've ever seen. To knock that fucker out and pin him. You felt something. It was meaningful that Will Ospreay won that match. Fair and square, locked in a cage, me and you. Your buddy managed to get in and I took him out too. You got your screwdriver and that didn't even matter. I proved that when the playing field is level, I'm better than you. That's pro wrestling. That's why we love this shit. On Monday, they didn't respect us enough to give us a finish. They had Roman Reigns pull one guy out of the ring. They don't care about the finish, and they've taught you not to care about it. Not me. I care about the finishes. What are we even watching this for if we don't care about the finishes? Netflix has hundreds of shows that are probably way better than the storytelling you're going to get out of hokey ass pro wrestling, where I don't even have to worry about the characters breaking into a pro wrestling match or a fake fight, where I don't even have to concern myself with who the winner is. Let's just cut that part out entirely and just go watch some TV shows. That'll never be me. Couldn't be me. Won't be me. Monday's match didn't even have a fucking finish. I'm not going to go as far as to say that we're comparing filet mignon to McDonald's when we're talking about Sunday's cage match versus Monday's. But it's not that far off. Sunday's wasn't a filet mignon. There were too many flaws. And the match itself on Monday, even though it wasn't any kind of classically entertaining cage match or anything like that, was too good to be McDonald's. But was this a T-bone steak versus a good hamburger? Yeah, that's what this was. It wasn't even close. It wasn't even close. Sunday over Monday by a pretty sizable margin.